Dr. Ayanna Morgan, a brilliant black surgeon, faces relentless racism and systemic corruption when she establishes a clinic to serve underserved communities. Her dedication to helping others makes her a target for a powerful city official bent on dismantling her efforts. Public humiliation, blatant prejudice, and abuse of power escalate as Ayanna fights to protect her clinic and reputation. Despite her success and humility, she's treated with suspicion and hostility, reflecting the painful realities of racism in America. This controversial story exposes the infuriating challenges of navigating systemic bias, while highlighting the resilience required to confront injustice. The smell of fresh coffee and buttery pastries filled the air as Dr. Ayanna Harper stepped into the small cafe nestled on the corner of West Elm Street. The bell above the door jingled softly, announcing her arrival to the intimate space that had become her morning retreat before work. The cafe was modest, nothing like the high-end bistros or power lunch spots her colleagues frequented, but it suited her. It reminded her of the places she used to visit growing up, where the barista knew your name and poured your coffee just the way you liked it without asking. At 42, Ayanna was one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the country. She was the head of neurology at the prestigious Hawthorne Medical Center, an institution known for both its cutting-edge research and its exclusivity. Her schedule was relentless, her responsibilities vast, but Ayanna carried it all with grace. Despite her success, she had never been one for ostentation. Her clothes were tailored but understated: a beige trench coat, navy slacks, and flats that were polished but practical. Her only nod to extravagance was the delicate gold necklace her mother had given her years ago, a symbol of the values that kept her grounded. Ayanna ordered her usual, a medium coffee with a splash of oat milk and a croissant, and found a seat near the window. The morning light filtered through the glass, casting a warm glow over the cafe's wooden tables and mismatched chairs. She pulled out her tablet, scrolling through patient notes and surgical schedules for the day ahead. Her focus was sharp, yet her presence was gentle, the kind that put people at ease. She was used to balancing these two energies. It was how she reassured anxious families in the hospital while commanding the respect of her peers in the operating room. But not everyone recognized the weight of the life she carried. Across the room, a soft but pointed murmur reached Ayanna's ears. She glanced up and noticed two women behind the counter, whispering while darting glances in her direction. Their expressions were a mixture of curiosity and judgment, their hushed words unintelligible, but heavy with implication. Ayanna knew that look. It was the same one she'd encountered countless times before, an unspoken question hanging in the air. What is she doing here? She returned her gaze to her tablet, willing herself to ignore it. She'd learned long ago that addressing such moments often only made them worse. Yet the whispering continued, a persistent hum that prickled at the edges of her composure. Ayanna's fingers hovered above the screen, her thoughts now clouded by the intrusion. She took a steadying breath, the familiar mantra her mother had taught her echoing in her mind. Hold your head high, baby girl. You don't owe anyone an explanation for your worth. The cafe door swung open again, this time with a burst of cold air that carried in a man in a crisp suit. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of presence that turned heads. The whispers behind the counter ceased abruptly, replaced by wide, welcoming smiles. Good morning, Mr. Hayes, one of the baristas chirped. Your usual? Of course, he replied smoothly, placing a crisp $20 bill on the counter. His tone was friendly, but there was an edge of entitlement in the way he moved, as though he expected the world to meet him on his terms. Ayanna watched him from the corner of her eye, recognizing him immediately. Richard Hayes, a prominent real estate developer and one of the hospital's biggest donors. Hayes didn't notice Ayanna at first. He was too busy basking in the warmth of the barista's attention, but as he turned to find a seat, his eyes landed on her, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, but not the pleasant kind. He strode toward her table with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Dr. Harper, he said, his voice low but pointed. What a surprise to see you here. Ayanna looked up, her calm demeanor unwavering. Mr. Hayes, she replied politely. Good morning. Hayes's eyes swept over her, taking in her casual outfit and the simplicity of her surroundings. I didn't expect to find you in a place like this, he said, the words dripping with a subtle condescension that set her teeth on edge. "Don't you usually frequent more upscale establishments?" Ayanna forced a smile. "I like the coffee here," she said simply, hoping to end the conversation before it spiraled into something more. But Hayes wasn't finished. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down uninvited, his expression turning serious. "I've been meaning to talk to you," he said, leaning forward, "about the expansion plans for the hospital." Ah, there it was, the real reason for his approach. Ayanna's chest tightened, but she kept her face neutral. She knew all too well about the expansion plans Hayes was referring to. They were a contentious issue within the hospital board, with Hayes pushing for luxury additions that catered to wealthy donors, while Ayanna advocated for expanding services for underserved communities. The debate had grown heated in recent weeks, and Hayes's tone now suggested he was ready to escalate. "I don't think this is the time or place for that discussion," Ayanna said evenly, glancing around the cafe, where the baristas were still stealing glances at their table. Hayes chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "Come on, doctor," he said. "You're too smart to play coy. This expansion could bring in millions of dollars for the hospital, money that could fund your research, your programs. It's a win-win." "For some of us," Ayanna countered, her voice calm but firm. "But not for the patients who need it most. The people who rely on this hospital don't need luxury suites, they need accessible care." Hayes's smile faltered, replaced by a thin line of irritation. "You're being short-sighted," he said. "This is about building a legacy, something that will put Hawthorne Medical on the map for generations." Ayanna met his gaze steadily. "And whose legacy are we building, Mr. Hayes, yours, or the community's?" For a moment, Hayes said nothing. His jaw tightened, and Ayanna could see the flash of anger in his eyes, quickly masked by a practiced smile. He stood abruptly, adjusting his suit jacket. "You're passionate, I'll give you that," he said, "but passion won't keep the lights on." As he turned to leave, Ayanna felt the weight of the room's eyes on her once again. She straightened her shoulders, determined not to let his words, or the judgment of the onlookers, unsettle her. She had spent her entire career fighting for what mattered, and she wasn't about to stop now. Still, as she finished her coffee and gathered her things, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The tension with Hayes was just one thread in a much larger web, a web she was beginning to realize would require every ounce of her resilience to untangle. The chilly morning air nipped at Ayanna's face as she stepped out of the cafe. She wrapped her trench coat tightly around her, trying to shake off the unease that lingered after her encounter with Richard Hayes. His condescension had been predictable, but it stung nonetheless. Ayanna had spent years dealing with men like Hayes, powerful, self-assured, and convinced that their vision of success was the only one that mattered. She told herself she wouldn't let it derail her focus, but deep down, a knot of frustration had taken root. The drive to Hawthorne Medical Center was smooth, the streets of the city still waking up to the rhythms of the day. Ayanna's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as she replayed the conversation in her mind, searching for ways she could have diffused the tension, or perhaps pushed back harder. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror. Ayanna frowned, glancing at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her car, a sleek yet understated black sedan, had no visible issues. Puzzled, she signaled and pulled to the side of the road, rolling down her window as a police officer approached. The officer was a tall man in his early 40s, with a rigid posture and an unreadable expression. His hand rested lightly on the holster at his hip as he leaned down to peer into her car. "License and registration," he said curtly. Ayanna handed over her documents without hesitation. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. He didn't answer right away, studying her license for a moment longer than necessary. "Where are you headed this morning?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced at her face, then back to the license. "To work," she replied evenly. "I'm a doctor at Hawthorne Medical." The officer's lips twitched, but he didn't quite smile. "Is that so?" he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "A doctor, huh?" Ayanna felt her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had been here before, seen this subtle questioning of her legitimacy, this refusal to believe her at face value. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice steady. Is there a problem, officer? He ignored her question, flipping through her registration. This your car? He asked, his gaze flicking back to her. It is, she said, her patience beginning to wear thin. If you check the registration, you'll see my name matches. The officer straightened, glancing over his shoulder at the patrol car idling behind hers. He seemed to be weighing something before finally speaking. We've had reports of vehicles matching this description involved in some break-ins nearby. Just doing my job. Ayanna took a slow breath, forcing herself to unclench her fists where they rested on the steering wheel. The explanation felt flimsy, but she knew better than to argue. I understand, she said, her voice measured. But as you can see, all my documents are in order. He lingered for another beat before handing back her license and registration. Stay out of trouble, he said, the words laced with condescension, as if he were doing her a favor by letting her go. Ayanna's jaw tightened, but she gave him a curt nod. Have a good day, officer, she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. As he walked back to his car, Ayanna took a moment to steady herself. Her chest felt tight, her thoughts a swirling mix of anger and helplessness. She had done everything right, everything she had been taught to do in these situations, and still, she had been treated with suspicion. It wasn't the first time, and she knew it wouldn't be the last, but the sting of it never dulled. By the time she reached the hospital, she had managed to push the incident to the back of her mind. The day ahead promised to be grueling, a full slate of surgeries, followed by a board meeting, where the expansion plans were sure to dominate the agenda. Ayanna threw herself into her work, her hands steady and precise as she navigated the delicate structures of the human brain. In the operating room, she felt a sense of control that eluded her in other aspects of her life. But outside the sterile walls of surgery, the tension followed her like a shadow. The board meeting that afternoon was held in the hospital's grand conference room, its long oak table surrounded by leather chairs that seemed to exude authority. Ayanna arrived early, hoping to review her notes one last time before the discussion began. To her surprise, Richard Hayes was already there, seated at the head of the table as though it were his by right. He greeted her with a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Harper, he said, his tone almost too cordial. I trust your morning was uneventful? Ayanna's stomach churned, but she refused to let him see her discomfort. Busy, as always, she replied smoothly, taking a seat across from him. I hope you're ready for a lively discussion. His smile widened, though it carried no warmth. Always, he said. I look forward to hearing your unique perspective. The other board members trickled in, their chatter filling the room as they took their seats. Ayanna watched them carefully, noting the subtle dynamics at play, the alliances, the unspoken hierarchies, the way certain voices seemed to carry more weight than others. It was a dance she had learned to navigate over the years, though it often felt like an uphill battle. As the meeting began, the discussion quickly turned to the expansion plans. Hayes, as expected, dominated the conversation, painting a picture of luxury suites and state-of-the-art facilities that would attract wealthy donors and elevate the hospital's reputation. Ayanna listened patiently, waiting for her turn to speak. When it came, she leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. While I appreciate the vision for these upgrades, she said, I believe we need to prioritize expanding access to care for underserved communities. The hospital's mission has always been about improving health outcomes for everyone, not just those who can afford high-end amenities. A murmur rippled through the room. Hayes' smile tightened, and he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her. Dr. Harper, he said, his tone patronizing. I understand your passion for community outreach, but we have to be realistic. These expansions will generate revenue that can fund the very programs you care about. And in the meantime, Ayanna countered, what happens to the patients who are already struggling to access basic care? Revenue doesn't mean much if people are left behind. The tension in the room was palpable, the other board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Hayes' expression darkened, and Ayanna could see the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone he clearly considered beneath him. We'll take it under advisement, he said finally, his tone clipped. But I think we all know where the board's priorities lie. Ayanna met his gaze steadily, refusing to back down. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "And I hope those priorities reflect the values this hospital was founded on." The meeting adjourned soon after, the air heavy with unspoken tension. As Ayanna gathered her things, she caught Hayes's gaze one last time. His eyes were cold, calculating, and she knew this wasn't over. The sharp ring of Ayanna's phone cut through the quiet of her office, breaking her focus as she reviewed patient files. She glanced at the caller ID. It was Valerie, one of the nurses she trusted most. Ayanna answered quickly, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Valerie, everything okay?" "No, Dr. Harper," Valerie said, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought you should know. There's been an incident at the clinic downtown. Some officers came by. They're saying there's a compliance issue, but it doesn't feel right." Ayanna's heart sank. The downtown clinic was one of the community's most vital resources, offering care to uninsured and low-income patients. She had fought hard to secure funding for it, and it had become a cornerstone of her mission. "What kind of compliance issue?" she asked, her tone sharp with urgency. "They're claiming the clinic violated some zoning laws, but we've never had any issues before. It feels like they're looking for something," Valerie replied. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Ayanna said, already gathering her coat and keys. When Ayanna arrived at the clinic, the scene was worse than she had imagined. 2 squad cars were parked outside, their flashing lights creating an ominous backdrop. A small crowd of patients and staff had gathered near the entrance, their expressions a mix of confusion and anger. Officer Daniels stood near the clinic's front door, clipboard in hand, speaking with one of the clinic's staff members. Ayanna's jaw tightened as she stepped out of her car. She had crossed paths with Officer Daniels before, and his disdain for her work had always been thinly veiled. Today, however, it seemed he was fully prepared to escalate their unspoken conflict. "Officer Daniels," she called as she approached, her voice calm but commanding. "What's going on here?" Daniels turned to her, his lips curling into a smug smile. "Dr. Harper," he said. "Nice of you to join us. We're conducting an inspection. Seems your clinic is operating in violation of local zoning ordinances." "That's impossible," Ayanna said firmly. "This clinic has been fully compliant since the day it opened. If there were any issues, they should have been flagged months ago. Not now, during operating hours." Daniels shrugged. "Well, we received an anonymous tip, just doing my job." Ayanna's temper flared, but she forced herself to remain composed. "You'll excuse me if I don't take anonymous tip at face value," she said. "What exactly are you looking for?" Daniels didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured to another officer, who began taking pictures of the clinic's interior through the windows. "We'll know when we find it," he said, his tone casual. The crowd behind Ayanna murmured in protest, their frustration mounting. A young mother holding a crying toddler stepped forward. "I've been waiting all week for this appointment," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't afford to go anywhere else. Are you shutting this place down?" Ayanna turned to the woman, her heart aching at the desperation in her voice. "No one is shutting anything down," she said firmly, then faced Daniels again. "If you have any legitimate concerns, I suggest you file them through the appropriate channels instead of staging a spectacle." Daniels smirked. "And I suggest you watch your tone, doctor. I wouldn't want things to get complicated." Ayanna's chest tightened. The threat was thinly veiled, but unmistakable. She glanced at the growing crowd, then back at Daniels. She couldn't afford to let this escalate further. Not here. Not now. "Fine," she said, her voice cool. "I'll contact my attorney and have this sorted out." Daniels's smirk widened. "You do that," he said, turning back to his clipboard as though dismissing her entirely. That evening, Ayanna sat in her home office, poring over zoning documents and legal precedents. She had called her attorney immediately after leaving the clinic, and while they were confident the allegations were baseless, the process of proving it could take weeks, time the clinic couldn't afford to lose. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Valerie, who had come by after her shift to offer support. She stepped in, her expression grim. "Dr. Harper, there's something else you should know," Valerie said, setting a folder on the desk. "I overheard one of the officers talking to a man in a suit. Someone from the hospital board." Ayanna's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "I didn't catch his name, but he mentioned Richard Hayes." Valerie said. "I think he's behind this." Ayanna's blood ran cold. Hayes's disdain for her work had always been clear, but this level of interference was unprecedented and deeply personal. She sat back in her chair, her mind racing. If Hayes was involved, this wasn't just about the clinic. It was about silencing her and dismantling everything she had built. "Thank you, Valerie," Ayanna said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I'll handle it from here." The next day, Ayanna called an emergency meeting with several trusted colleagues, including Mitchell, a senior administrator who had always been quietly supportive of her mission. They gathered in her office, the tension palpable. "We have a problem," Ayanna began, laying out the situation. "The clinic is under attack, and I have reason to believe Richard Hayes is involved. This isn't just about zoning laws, it's about undermining our work and everything we stand for." Mitchell frowned. "If Hayes is involved, this could get ugly. He has connections. Ayanna, powerful ones." "I'm aware," she said, her resolve hardening. "But that doesn't mean we back down. The clinic is too important to this community." Another colleague, Dr. Ramirez, leaned forward. "What's the plan? How do we fight this?" Ayanna took a deep breath. "First, we gather evidence. If Hayes is pulling strings, we need proof Valerie overheard a conversation. If we can corroborate her account, we might have a case. Second, we rally the community. This clinic exists because of their support, and they deserve to know what's happening. If we make enough noise, Hayes won't be able to sweep this under the rug." Mitchell nodded slowly. "It's risky, but it's the right move. You'll need to be careful, though Hayes won't go down without a fight." Ayanna met his gaze, her determination unwavering. "I'm counting on it." The following week was a whirlwind of action. Ayanna reached out to community leaders, organized a town hall meeting, and began gathering testimonies from patients and staff. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people came forward, eager to share their stories and defend the clinic's mission. But the tension reached its peak when Ayanna received an anonymous envelope at her office. Inside was a stack of documents. Emails between Richard Hayes and city officials, outlining a coordinated effort to shut down the clinic under false pretenses. The final email was the most damning. It contained direct instructions from Hayes to Officer Daniels, urging him to find any excuse to disrupt operations. Ayanna stared at the documents, her heart pounding. This was the proof she needed, but it also painted a chilling picture of just how far Hayes was willing to go to protect his interests. As she prepared for the town hall that evening, Ayanna felt a mix of anger and resolve. The stakes had never been higher, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't back down. The room was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. Ayanna stepped onto the stage, the envelope of evidence in hand. She looked out at the crowd, patients, staff, neighbors, and even a few reporters, and took a deep breath. "This clinic was built to serve this community," she began, her voice steady but powerful. "But there are those who would see it destroyed, not because it's failing, but because it threatens their vision of who deserves care." The crowd murmured in agreement, their energy palpable. Ayanna held up the envelope. "Tonight, I'll share the truth with you. The truth about who is behind this attack, and why. But first, I need you to understand one thing. We are not powerless together. We can stand against this injustice together. We can fight back." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing like a battle cry. Ayanna felt a surge of hope, but she knew the fight was just beginning. The town hall's air was thick with tension, as Ayanna's words hung in the room like a storm cloud. The envelope of evidence sat on the podium in front of her, its presence a silent but powerful reminder of what was at stake. The crowd, an eclectic mix of community members, patients, and supporters, buzzed with restless energy. Whispers of outrage and murmurs of anticipation rippled through the room. As Ayanna scanned the audience, she caught sight of Mitchell near the back. His expression was one of quiet encouragement, though his furrowed brow betrayed his worry. To his right, Valerie sat with a group of nurses, her arms crossed as she glared toward the few skeptical faces in the room. Ayanna felt a flicker of gratitude for her allies. They were her foundation in this fight. But amidst the sea of supportive faces, Ayanna spotted Richard Hayes standing near the exit, his posture rigid, his lips curled into a faint smirk. The sight of him was like a cold wind cutting through her resolve. She knew this wasn't just a battle for the clinic's survival. It was a battle against a system that empowered men like Hayes to wield unchecked influence. "I have here," Ayanna began, lifting the envelope, "proof that this attack on our clinic is not about compliance or zoning laws. It is a coordinated effort to shut down a lifeline for this community, a lifeline that threatens the interests of those who value power over people." The murmurs grew louder, a wave of emotion cresting in the room. Hayes's smirk faltered as he realized the focus had shifted to him. Ayanna opened the envelope and held up one of the damning emails. The words seemed to burn into the air as she read them aloud. "Find any excuse to disrupt operations," she quoted, her voice steady but laced with steel. "This email, sent by Richard Hayes to Officer Daniels, exposes the lengths to which they've gone to sabotage the work we do here." Gasps and angry murmurs erupted from the crowd. Hayes straightened, his face a mask of indignation, but Ayanna pressed on. "This isn't just about me or this clinic," she continued. "It's about every person who has been denied care, every family that has struggled to access the resources they need, and it's about holding those in power accountable for their actions." Mitchell stood and spoke, his deep voice cutting through the din. "Dr. Harper has fought tirelessly for this community. We cannot allow this to continue, Richard Hayes. If you have an explanation, now is the time to give it." All eyes turned to Hayes, who stepped forward reluctantly. His smirk was gone, replaced by a practiced expression of indignation. "These accusations are baseless," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This clinic has been under scrutiny for valid reasons. Dr. Harper's claims are nothing more than a desperate attempt to deflect from her own failings." The crowd erupted into shouts of protest, but Ayanna raised her hand, quieting them. "If the claims are baseless, Mr. Hayes," she said, "then why are there documented communications between you and Officer Daniels? Why were zoning laws, which have been clear and unchanged for years, suddenly an issue the moment this clinic began thriving?" Hayes hesitated, his carefully constructed mask slipping for a fraction of a second. The crowd sensed the vulnerability, their anger intensifying. Valerie stood and shouted, "You've never cared about this community. You only care about your bottom line." Ayanna saw an opportunity and seized it. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone sharp, "if you truly have nothing to hide, then you won't object to an independent investigation into your actions." Hayes's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're turning this into a circus." "No," Ayanna said, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. "We're turning this into accountability." The room erupted again, the crowd's fury directed squarely at Hayes. He turned and stormed out of the hall, his retreat a small but significant victory. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Ayanna's call for an independent investigation gained traction, with local reporters picking up the story. Hayes's name became synonymous with corruption, and the pressure on city officials mounted. Officer Daniels, who had remained largely silent, was now being scrutinized as well. But the fight was far from over. Hayes's allies in the hospital board began to push back, using their influence to sow doubt about Ayanna's motives. Anonymous threats were left at the clinic, warning her to back down. One morning, Ayanna found her car vandalized, the word "liar" spray-painted across the hood. The attacks were a stark reminder of the stakes, but Ayanna refused to be intimidated. Instead, she doubled down, organizing a rally in front of City Hall. Hundreds of community members showed up, their presence a testament to the impact of her work. Patients shared their stories, their voices amplifying the urgency of the moment. At the rally's conclusion, Ayanna stood before the crowd, her voice carrying the weight of their collective resolve. "We will not be silenced," she declared. "This is our fight, and we will see it through." That night, as Ayanna reviewed the progress of the investigation, she received a call from Mitchell. "Ayanna," he said, his tone grave, "I just got a tip. Hayes is planning something big. He's desperate, and he's not above playing dirty." "What do you mean?" Ayanna asked, her grip tightening on the phone. "He's working with a group on the board to fast-track a decision to revoke the clinic's funding. If they succeed, the clinic will be forced to close within days." Ayanna's heart pounded. This was the escalation she had feared, but she refused to let panic take hold. "We won't let that happen," she said firmly. "We have the evidence. If they push forward, they'll expose themselves even more." Mitchell hesitated. "Just be careful. Hayes won't go down without a fight." Ayanna hung up, her mind racing. She knew the next move had to be decisive, bold, and undeniable. As the night stretched on, she crafted a plan that would either solidify their victory or risk everything. The stakes had never been higher. The fight for justice was nearing its breaking point, and Ayanna Harper was ready to meet it head-on. The conference room at City Hall buzzed with an uneasy tension as Ayanna Harper stepped through its glass doors. Around the long, oval table sat the hospital board members, their faces a mix of skepticism and discomfort. At the head of the table, Richard Hayes leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed in a show of defiance. Beside him sat Officer Daniels, his posture rigid, his gaze darting around the room. This wasn't just another meeting, it was the moment Ayanna had been preparing for. Ayanna placed a thick folder on the table and met Hayes's gaze head-on. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but firm. "Today, we address not just the fate of the Harper Clinic, but the integrity of this board and the trust of our community." Hayes smirked, his veneer of confidence unshaken. "Dr. Harper," he drawled, "let's not turn this into a spectacle. We're here to discuss your clinic's repeated violations, not entertain baseless accusations." Ayanna ignored his attempt to rattle her. "Mr. Hayes," she replied, her tone razor-sharp, "I think the board and the community deserve to know the full story before any decisions are made." She opened the folder, revealing a series of documents and emails she had painstakingly collected over the past weeks. She slid the top sheet across the table toward the board president, a measured man named Alan Briggs. "This," Ayanna said, her voice rising slightly to ensure the room heard her, "is an internal communication from Mr. Hayes, instructing city officials to find any excuse to obstruct the clinic's operations. It's dated 3 days before the first surprise inspection." The room shifted. Briggs adjusted his glasses, scanning the document, while the other members leaned in to get a closer look. Hayes's smirk faltered, but quickly returned, this time tinged with annoyance. "Anyone can fabricate an email," he said dismissively. "This proves nothing." Ayanna stepped closer to the table, her confidence unwavering. "Let's see if you feel the same about this." She pulled out a second document, this one showing financial transactions between Hayes's personal accounts and a subcontractor hired to block permits for the clinic's expansion. "This is a direct link between you and the firm responsible for halting our expansion. Care to explain why your personal funds were used, Mr. Hayes?" Hayes's jaw tightened, his composure cracking. "Those funds were for a legitimate business venture," he snapped. "This is a smear campaign, nothing more." Briggs's brow furrowed as he examined the evidence. The room buzzed with murmurs, the tide clearly shifting. Ayanna saw her opening. "Mr. Hayes," she pressed, "this isn't just about the clinic, it's about your abuse of power, your attempt to silence a resource that threatens your interests. You've jeopardized the health and well-being of thousands for personal gain." The confrontation had drawn the attention of more than just the board. Through the glass walls of the conference room, city employees and reporters began to gather, their eyes fixed on the escalating showdown. Ayanna knew the stakes. If she faltered now, Hayes could spin this in his favor. "Enough," Hayes barked, slamming a hand on the table. "You have no idea how the real world works, Dr. Harper. You think you can play hero, but you're just a pawn in a game you don't understand." Ayanna's gaze hardened. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not playing a game. This clinic is about saving lives, not power or profit, and if you think this ends here, you're mistaken." At that moment, Officer Daniels stood, his expression conflicted. "Dr. Harper," he began, his voice low but audible, "I need to say something." Hayes turned on him, his face a mix of anger and panic. "Daniels, sit down." But Daniels remained standing. "No," he said, more firmly this time. "I've been part of this long enough. What we've done, it's wrong. The inspections, the permits, the false reports, it was all orchestrated by Hayes." The room fell silent. Ayanna felt a surge of vindication, but kept her expression controlled. Daniels continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I was told to keep the clinic under constant scrutiny, to write up violations whether they were real or not. I didn't realize how far it had gone until now." "You spineless," Hayes began, but Briggs cut him off. "That's enough," Briggs said, his voice firm. He turned to Hayes, his expression dark. "These are serious allegations, Richard. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Hayes's composure finally shattered. He rose from his chair, pointing a finger at Ayanna. This is a witch hunt. She's manipulating all of you. But the evidence and Daniel's confession were too damning. Briggs stood, his face a mask of disappointment. Mr. Hayes, I'm calling for an immediate suspension of your duties pending a full investigation. The room erupted into chaos, as Hayes's protests were drowned out by the murmurs of the board, and the onlookers outside. Ayanna felt a weight lift from her shoulders, though the fight was far from over. As the meeting adjourned, Ayanna stepped into the hallway, her mind racing. Reporters swarmed her, shouting questions about the evidence and the confrontation. She answered briefly, emphasizing the need for accountability and systemic change, before making her way to the clinic. That evening, as she sat in her office, the gravity of the day's events settled over her. Hayes's influence had been dealt a critical blow, but the system he represented was still intact. She knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Valerie stepped in, a small smile on her face. You did it, she said, her voice tinged with pride. Ayanna shook her head. We did it, but this is just the beginning. Valerie nodded, her expression growing serious. I know, but tonight, you can take a moment to breathe. You've earned that much. As Ayanna leaned back in her chair, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. The next steps were uncertain, but she was ready to face them head-on. The Harper Clinic's community room, usually a sanctuary for hopeful patients and their families, buzzed with tension. Ayanna Harper stood at the center, her calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside her. Across from her stood Richard Hayes, flanked by his remaining allies, members of the board who hadn't yet defected from his camp. Officer Daniels lingered near the back, his expression a complex mix of guilt and trepidation. The confrontation that had been simmering for months was finally boiling over. Hayes adjusted his tie, his smirk a calculated attempt to mask the cracks in his confidence. Dr. Harper, he said, his voice oozing condescension. This charade has gone on long enough. You've made your accusations, thrown your baseless evidence around, but the fact remains. Your clinic operates on borrowed time. The city doesn't need a liability like you. Ayanna held his gaze, unflinching. This clinic is not a liability, she said, her voice steady. It's a lifeline, and the only thing jeopardizing its future is your greed and prejudice. The crowd of onlookers, patients, staff, and reporters who had caught wind of the showdown, murmured. Ayanna could feel their hope and anger simmering behind her, a collective force she was determined not to let down. Prejudice? Hayes scoffed, raising his hands as if she'd said something absurd. You're playing the victim card again, typical. Ayanna's lips tightened, but she refused to take the bait. Instead, she turned to the gathered crowd. Let me make this clear, she said, her voice rising with conviction. This isn't just about me or this clinic. It's about a system that punishes anyone who tries to uplift the vulnerable. It's about leaders like Richard Hayes, who prioritize their profits over people's lives. Enough, Hayes barked, stepping forward. His carefully constructed facade was slipping, his voice tinged with desperation. You think you can come into my town, build your empire, and what, tear me down? You're nothing more than an opportunist. Ayanna stepped closer, her presence commanding. Your town. This town belongs to its people. The mothers who bring their children here because they can't afford the private hospitals you fund, the elders who depend on this clinic because you've gutted their healthcare programs. Those are the people who built this community. Not you. The room erupted into applause, the crowd's support emboldening Ayanna. But it wasn't just their voices driving her forward. It was the weight of every patient she'd ever treated, every obstacle she'd overcome to be here. Hayes's face darkened. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped. Everything I've done, every decision I've made, has been for the good of this city. You're out of your depth. Ayanna pulled a folder from the table behind her. Let's see if the good of this city includes bribing city officials to block our expansion, she said, holding up the damning documents. Or funneling funds from public health programs into private development projects under your name. Does that sound like public service to you? The air in the room grew heavy, the evidence like a guillotine hanging over Hayes. For a moment, he faltered, his composure slipping further, but then his arrogance returned, fueled by years of impunity. "Even if that's true," he said, his tone dismissive, "you think these people care? They need leadership, real leadership, not a bleeding heart who doesn't understand the cost of doing business." Ayanna's voice sharpened. "Leadership isn't exploiting the vulnerable, Hayes. It's standing with them, fighting for them, even when it's inconvenient. That's what this clinic does, and that's what you've tried so hard to destroy." Before Hayes could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Officer Daniels stepped forward, his movements hesitant but deliberate. All eyes turned to him as he cleared his throat, his face pale but resolute. "She's right," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Everything she's saying about Hayes, it's true, I know, because I helped enforce it." The room fell silent, the weight of Daniels' confession sinking in. Hayes turned on him, his face twisted with fury. "Daniels, don't you dare!" "No!" Daniels interrupted, his voice louder now. "You don't get to shut me up anymore. I've done enough damage covering for you, following your orders, pretending it was just protocol. But it wasn't. It was corruption. It was wrong." Ayanna watched Daniels, her expression a mix of surprise and respect. She had hoped for his support, but hadn't expected such a public reckoning. Daniels turned to the crowd, his hands trembling slightly. "I was part of the inspections," he admitted. "I wrote up violations that didn't exist. I delayed permits on purpose. I did everything Hayes told me to because I thought it was just part of the job, but it wasn't. It was about shutting down something good, and I'm done being part of it." The crowd erupted, their anger and outrage directed squarely at Hayes. Reporters clamored to capture the moment, their cameras and microphones trained on the unfolding drama. Hayes, for the first time, looked cornered. "You spineless traitor!" he hissed at Daniels, his voice venomous. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Daniels stood firm. "I've done the right thing." Ayanna stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "It's over, Hayes. Your lies, your corruption, they're out in the open now. You can't hide behind your power anymore." Hayes glared at her, his confidence shattered. "You think this changes anything? You'll still fail. You'll never—" "Enough." Briggs, the board president, had entered the room unnoticed and now stood at the back. His booming voice silenced the room. "Hayes, you've disgraced this board, this community, and yourself. As of this moment, you are suspended pending an investigation." The room erupted again, this time in cheers and applause. Hayes's face turned ashen, his bravado reduced to a hollow shell. He stumbled back, muttering under his breath, before storming out of the room. Ayanna felt the weight of the confrontation settle over her. The fight wasn't over. There would be fallout, investigations, and likely more challenges ahead. But for now, she had won. As the crowd surged forward to thank her, to offer their support, Ayanna caught Daniel's eye. He nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement of the part they had both played in this moment. For the first time in months, Ayanna allowed herself a small, genuine smile. The road ahead was uncertain, but today, justice had taken its first step forward. The aftermath of the climactic confrontation at the Harper Clinic rippled through the town and beyond. Within hours, news outlets were broadcasting the dramatic revelations, with headlines like, "Local business leader exposed for corruption," and "Clinic's fight against injustice sparks community uprising." Richard Hayes, once a towering figure of influence, was officially suspended from the city's development board, pending a thorough investigation. The weight of public opinion quickly turned against him, his network of allies dissolving as they scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The evidence Ayanna presented, bolstered by Officer Daniels' confession, was damning. Documents revealing Hayes's bribes, fraudulent permits, and intentional sabotage of the clinic were handed over to the district attorney, who promised a swift and comprehensive investigation. In the days that followed, more individuals stepped forward, emboldened by Ayanna's courage. Former employees of Hayes's organization shared their own experiences of coercion and exploitation, painting a damning picture of a man who had built his empire on intimidation and deceit. Captain Monroe, who had been skeptical of the claims against Hayes initially, issued a public statement acknowledging the need for systemic change within the city's institutions. Dr. Harper's unwavering fight for justice has revealed not just individual wrongdoing, but systemic failures, he said during a televised press conference. We owe it to her, and to the community, to ensure this never happens again. The clinic's reputation, once tarnished by false claims of mismanagement, was restored. Donations poured in from across the state, with individuals, businesses, and even national organizations expressing their support for Ayanna's work. The funds allowed the clinic not only to remain open, but to expand its services, offering free health screenings, mental health counseling, and a new program for community outreach. For Ayanna, the journey had been transformative. The woman who had once hesitated to confront power directly now stood confidently in her convictions. She had always believed in the importance of her work, but this battle had revealed a deeper truth. Her voice, her courage, and her ability to stand firm in the face of injustice could inspire change far beyond the walls of her clinic. Reflecting on the ordeal, Ayanna realized she had gained something invaluable, a renewed sense of purpose. She no longer saw her work as simply providing healthcare, but as part of a broader fight for equity and dignity. The community's overwhelming support reminded her that she wasn't alone in this fight. In a quiet moment back in her office, Ayanna pulled out the letter she had drafted months earlier, resigning from her position when the pressure felt insurmountable. She smiled faintly before tearing it into pieces. Giving up wasn't an option, not when so many people were counting on her. The exposure of Hayes's corruption sparked a chain reaction of reforms. The city council, under mounting pressure from constituents, announced a series of measures to ensure greater transparency and accountability. These included stricter oversight of development projects, mandatory ethics training for public officials, and the establishment of an independent watchdog group to monitor municipal operations. At Ayanna's urging, the council also approved funding for a community liaison office, designed to bridge the gap between local government and underserved populations. The office, staffed by social workers and advocates, would work directly with residents to address their concerns and connect them with resources. Ayanna herself was invited to consult on its formation, a role she accepted with enthusiasm. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels's decision to speak out had its own ripple effects. Though he faced disciplinary action for his involvement in Hayes's schemes, he was also lauded for his courage in coming clean. Daniels chose to resign from the police force, stating that he needed time to reflect and rebuild his integrity. He later joined a local nonprofit focused on police reform, using his experience to advocate for changes within law enforcement. Despite the victories, Ayanna knew the fight wasn't over. The reforms were a step in the right direction, but systemic change was a marathon, not a sprint. There were still those who harbored resentment toward her, viewing her as a troublemaker who had disrupted the status quo. And while Hayes's downfall was gratifying, Ayanna couldn't ignore the lingering challenges of dismantling the structures that had enabled his behavior. One evening, as Ayanna walked through the clinic's newly renovated wing, she paused to watch a group of children playing in the waiting area. Their laughter was a balm to her weary soul, a reminder of why she had chosen this path. Behind her, a nurse approached with a smile. "Dr. Harper," she said, "there's a young mother who wants to thank you. Her son's surgery was covered by one of the new grants." Ayanna nodded, her chest swelling with quiet pride. These were the moments that made the struggle worthwhile, the tangible proof that her efforts were making a difference. Later that night, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, Ayanna let herself breathe. The air was cool, the stars bright against the inky sky. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. She had faced down prejudice, corruption, and doubt, emerging stronger for it. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, she was ready to walk it, step by step. The story didn't end there. Ayanna's fight for justice had captured national attention, drawing invitations to speak at conferences and join coalitions advocating for healthcare reform. She accepted these opportunities cautiously, determined not to let them detract from her work at the clinic. But she couldn't ignore the growing calls for her to take on a larger role, perhaps even a political one. As she considered the possibilities, Ayanna resolved to remain true to herself and her mission. Whether in a courtroom, a boardroom, or her clinic, her goal remained the same: to create a world where dignity and justice weren't privileges, but guarantees. For now, though, she focused on the present, the patients who needed her, the staff who looked up to her, and the community that had rallied around her. Together, they had faced adversity and triumphed together. They would continue to build a future worth fighting for. Ayanna Harper sat in her clinic's modest office, a quiet smile playing on her lips as she gazed at the framed photograph on her desk. It was a snapshot of the clinic's staff and patients taken at the recent reopening event, a moment of celebration after months of struggle. In the photo, everyone stood together, their faces illuminated by hope and gratitude, a testament to what they had overcome. The journey to this moment had been anything but easy. For Ayanna, the fight against Richard Hayes and his web of corruption had been deeply personal, forcing her to confront not only external injustices, but also her own doubts and fears. Yet, through the turbulence, she had grown. The quiet, hard-working doctor, who once preferred to avoid conflict, had emerged as a fierce advocate for her community, unafraid to take on the powerful forces that sought to silence her. Reflecting on her journey, Ayanna saw how the experience had reshaped her. She had learned to channel her frustration into purposeful action, to find strength in vulnerability, and to trust in the power of collective support. The challenges she faced had stripped away any illusions she held about the world's fairness, but they had also revealed an unshakable truth. Resilience wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about rising from it with renewed determination. Her clinic, once on the brink of closure, now stood as a beacon of hope in the community. Its expanded services were already making a tangible difference, offering care to those who had long been overlooked. The staff, reinvigorated by Ayanna's leadership, worked tirelessly, their dedication inspired by her example. But Ayanna's growth extended beyond the walls of the clinic. She had become a voice for change in the broader fight against systemic inequities. Invitations to speak at conferences, collaborate on reform initiatives, and even consider public office poured in. Each opportunity was a reminder that her story had resonated far beyond Birchwood Heights, inspiring others to confront injustice in their own lives. Ayanna's fight had exposed more than just Richard Hayes' corruption. It had peeled back the layers of systemic racism, power imbalances, and economic exploitation that had long plagued communities like hers. The backlash she faced, the skepticism, the veiled threats, the public attempts to discredit her, were all rooted in a system designed to maintain the status quo. But by standing her ground, Ayanna had disrupted that system, forcing it to reckon with its failures. Her story also highlighted the resilience of those who are often marginalized. Despite the obstacles, Ayanna and her community had persevered, proving that collective action could dismantle even the most entrenched structures of power. Their victory was a reminder that change begins at the grassroots level, with ordinary people refusing to accept the unacceptable. In the aftermath of the Hayes scandal, the city of Birchwood Heights had begun to change. The reforms Ayanna championed, a revamped police training program, community dialogue initiatives, and stricter oversight of public projects, were just the beginning. More importantly, they sparked a cultural shift, encouraging residents to demand accountability and fairness in all aspects of governance. For those following Ayanna's story, her resilience served as a powerful lesson. It was easy to feel powerless in the face of systemic injustice, to believe that one person couldn't make a difference. But Ayanna had shown that courage, persistence, and a willingness to stand up for what's right could inspire change on a larger scale. Her message to the audience was clear. No matter how daunting the challenge, progress was possible through collective effort. She urged people to look beyond their individual struggles and find strength in their communities. "We are stronger together," she often said during her speeches. "When we fight for each other, we fight for a better future for everyone." Ayanna's journey also underscored the importance of empathy and understanding. Her ability to connect with people, whether it was the patients who trusted her with their health, the neighbors who rallied around her clinic, or even Officer Daniels, who had chosen to break ranks and tell the truth, had been key to her success. She reminded her audience that real change came not from tearing others down, but from building bridges and fostering dialogue. As Ayanna stood on the clinic's front steps later that evening, the familiar sights and sounds of the neighborhood filled her with a sense of peace. Children laughed as they chased each other down the street, parents exchanged greetings as they walked home, and the glow of porch lights illuminated the tightly knit community she had fought so hard to protect. In the distance, the new community center, a project Ayanna had advocated for, stood proudly, its lights shining like a beacon. It symbolized the future she envisioned, a place where everyone, regardless of their background, could find support and opportunity. Ayanna closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the crisp evening air. The fight was far from over. She knew that. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of gratitude. Gratitude for her community, for the allies who had stood by her, and for the inner strength she had discovered along the way. Her journey had taught her that justice wasn't a destination, but a continuous effort. It required vigilance, courage, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But it was also worth every sacrifice, every sleepless night, and every moment of doubt. As she opened her eyes, Ayanna's gaze settled on the horizon. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she felt ready to face them. The road to equity and justice was long and winding, but she was no longer walking it alone. In her heart, she carried the stories of everyone she had fought for and with. Stories of resilience, hope, and the unwavering belief that a better world was possible. And with every step she took, she carried the conviction that their fight, their courage, and their triumphs would light the way for others to follow. Ayanna's story wasn't just a tale of one woman's fight against injustice, it was a call to action for anyone who believed in the power of change. It was a reminder that while the road to justice was difficult, it was a journey worth taking. One step, one voice, one victory at a time.